Hi, I'm Tom Birkeland, author of An Introduction to the Policy Process and professor of public policy at North Carolina State University. I hope you enjoy the book, and I hope you find these videos useful.
Welcome back. In this video, I want to discuss the policy system. The policy system thought of as an input-output model to help us simplify and organize our thinking about how public policy is made. And as usual in this book, this is draws heavily on national level policymaking in the United States, although I imagine you'll be able to draw some parallels between the way it works at the federal level and the way it works at state levels in the United States, or how it works in different countries. And indeed, if there's something here that you think works really differently in your country, you may want to think about that, and certainly share those thoughts with me if you'd like to discuss them further. So let's get into this notion of the policy cycle and inputs and outputs into the policy system. Okay, so let's do this overview of the policy system. But what I mean by the policy process as a system is it's a system that includes three elements: the policymaking environment, the inputs into the system, and the outputs from the system. I want to start with an overview of a traditional view of policy, the stages model or stages heuristic. The stages heuristic is a term that was used by Paul Sabatier, a very prominent figure in policy studies. And a heuristic is like a checklist or a set of rules of thumb. It's not really a model in the classic scientific sense of the term, but we'll use that to organize our thinking going forward about the public policy process. The stages model of the policy process, I believe, owes a lot to systems models of politics in the United States, and that's why I combine these two elements in this video and in this section of the textbook. Now, you may have seen this before in your other studies of politics or policymaking, the classic stages model or stages heuristic of the policy process, which begins with issue emergence. That is, we learn of a problem. As I'm recording this video, we're in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, so maybe use that as an example. The issue emerges. We learn that there's this problem. There's this new disease called coronavirus or COVID. So the issue emerges on the agenda. It moves up the agenda. That's the agenda setting process. That means it's getting more and more attention from the media and from policymakers. Then a bunch of policies to address the problems caused, in this case, by coronavirus, economic policies, health policies, things like that, are developed and then selected and ultimately enacted into law. That's the enactment box there. And then once a law is enacted, the law or the program is implemented. So, for example, the federal government can have a program that says we'll spend all this money on vaccines and distribute it to states. That doesn't just happen automatically. It has to be implemented. People have to make the effort to make that happen. And implementation is a very important part of the process. Then we evaluate policy implementation to see if it worked, to see if the policy did the things that we had set it up to do. And we study the policy. We get data about the policy and information, and that feeds back into the policy cycle or the policy system as depicted here. Now, there's some weaknesses to this stages model or stages heuristic, but there's also some strengths, or at least one strength, and I want to highlight the strengths and weaknesses here. One of the weaknesses is that this model has long implied a beginning and an end of the policy process. Oftentimes you would see these stages not as a cycle, but as a list, starting from issue emergence and ending with evaluation. But the cycle is actually endless, and there's not just one cycle in any political system. Think about the United States. Think about all the different kinds of policies that are being made all the time about the environment, about health, about education. And they're being made at the federal, state, and local level. So there's all these cycles going on within what we could call policy domains or policy communities. So not only is the cycle endless, but there are lots of these cycles. So it's a lot more complex than it looks. But again, it's a good way of organizing our thinking. A second weakness is that it implies an ordering of stages. They come in sequential order. That is, that issue emergence happens before agenda setting, and then alternative selection happens after an issue gets in the agenda, But stages in the policy process can be skipped or taken out of order. For example, we can skip evaluation. Sometimes policies aren't even evaluated. Sometimes policies are enacted even though the issue isn't very prominent on the agenda because somebody was able to get the ear of a sympathetic legislator or member of the executive branch. So it doesn't have to happen in this order. It's also important to note that it doesn't have to run its full course. A lot of times issues emerge on the agenda and are raised on the agenda, but don't go any further than that. An example I would bring up is a lot of the school shooting incidents of the last 20 some odd years have not resulted in significant changes to gun policy at the federal level in the United States. Some changes at the state level, but at the federal level, not as much as you might suspect, considering the high profile nature of those events. So one of the things we study in policy studies is why is it that some high profile events don't get a lot of attention or don't move policy in a particular direction. So don't look at the policy cycle and believe that everything has to follow this order. And the stages can overlap. This relates to the previous point about the stages happening out of order. Stages can happen simultaneously. For example, you can be implementing a policy and evaluating it at the same time. Or issue emergence and agenda setting can happen at about the same time, particularly if the issue very rapidly emerges on the agenda, such as terrorism after September 11th, or such as pandemic diseases in the wake of COVID. Those things happened very quickly, that the issue emerged and got very high on the agenda very quickly. So these stages can overlap. But there is one considerable strength to the policy cycle or the stages heuristic, and that is that it is a good way of organizing our thinking. A lot of us say that we study policy implementation or we study agenda setting or we study the process by which alternatives are selected. So a lot of us specialize in various aspects of the policy process, and learning more about each aspect then taken together can help us learn about the policy cycle or the policy process as a whole. Now, when we get into chapter 11, we'll ask ourselves whether these more advanced models of the policy process encompass all these different aspects or stages of the policy process. So now let's look at figure 2.2 in the book, which is the systems model of politics and policy. And you can take a look at it in the textbook, but the way I've drawn it is the big blue box is the policy environment that shapes both the inputs into the system and the outputs. And then that political system or black box is the thing that translates inputs into outputs. And what I would suggest is that the policy cycle that I just showed, or the stages model, is one way of sort of making sense of that black box. A black box implies a system that is not clear when you look at it from the outside in. A lot of processes, we say, appear to behave like a black box. The idea of a black box is that you don't know how it works. You just see what goes into it and what comes out of it. The idea is that that box is kind of opaque, and our goal in policy studies is to make that box transparent. And so let's see what we can do about making that a little more transparent by looking at the policy environment and at the elements of the system model. I just said before, the environment influences the system. The inputs in broad terms are public demands for policies, and the outputs are public policies themselves. The political system is the black box, as we said before, and the question that we're concerned with is, how does the black box work? And this is the essential question of policy studies, and this is what a lot of our models of the policy process attempt to explain. Now, the boundaries between these elements are blurry. What is a feature of the environment versus what is a feature of an input or an output, for example? And in fact, sometimes an output can be an input. the output of the system can be an input into the next cycle of the process. So we don't want to overdraw the idea of the boundaries between, say, the policy environment and the inputs and outputs themselves, but we want to use this as a way of organizing our thinking about the policy process. So let's talk about the structural environment then in which policy is made in the United States. And what I maintain throughout this book is that the real way of understanding the policy environment is to consider the constitutional order in the United States. And the constitutional order includes a lot of different features, including three prominent ones I want to talk about here. The separation of powers, that is the separation of governing powers into the three branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial. That's more finely drawn in the United States Constitution than it is in some other countries. A second feature of our constitutional order, and therefore the structural environment, is federalism. And the third feature that I want to add that I don't hit that hard in the chapter, but I think it's important to add now, is the rule of law. There's a deep cultural commitment in the United States to the rule of law, and that's been tested in the last 4 years. But in some ways, the rule of law has persisted in shaping the way policies are made in the United States, that there's a lot of people who would like to do certain things, but ultimately legally they cannot. And it's Americans' affinity for legal process and the rule of law rather than simply the exercise of raw political power that characterizes our system and characterizes its stability over the last 200 some odd years. Now, there's also some rules for governance that are a part of the structural environment. And what I mean by these are two enactments that structure the way in which the government does its business. There are a lot of other rules, but the two that I wanted to highlight are the Administrative Procedure Act, which is the law that governs how federal agencies announce that they're going to enact new regulations, and the Freedom of Information Act, which is an enactment that was passed in the wake of the Nixon administration to provide people with more information about what the government is doing. So those are two sort of rules that shape how our governance system works. There are a lot more that I could have discussed here. The rules of how the Congress works, how the House and Senate do their business, how the individual states do their business, things like that. But this is a general overview of the structural environment. But now we're going to talk about an input. And the first input I want to talk about is public opinion. And we often measure public opinion by polling. And public opinion is an important input because it helps get a sense of what the public is concerned about and what the public is willing to accept in terms of policy interventions. Now, you've probably heard a lot about polling in the last several years and about how the polls have sometimes missed various electoral trends, but by and large, most trends are generally reliable. And a lot of polls are about elections and about issues. But the polls that ask questions about major issues of the day are interesting and worthwhile to study because they give you a sense of what people think is important. And in this chapter, you'll see that I describe the political environment. And we ask in public opinion polls, for example, what's the most important issue facing the country? Or, is the country on the right track or the wrong track? That kind of information is helpful to policymakers as they try to understand what sort of things people have in their mind and what sort of policies people are willing to see enacted. But polls are not the only input into decision making. I don't think that we should place too much stock in polls, and there is some criticism of politicians who are strictly governed by polls. The idea is that they're only doing the things that are the most popular. Now, in a democracy, you might say, well, sometimes maybe we should do the things that are most popular. That's what the people want. But there are maybe good reasons not to pursue the most popular ideas. But what polls can do is also help people clarify their message. If, for example, in this current COVID pandemic, there was a lot of polling data that said that people didn't really want to take the COVID vaccine right away. And so public health officials would look at that data and say, we need to do a better job of messaging about the safety and efficacy of vaccines so people will take them. And in fact, in the several weeks between the polls in late 2020, we saw an upturn in the number of people who were willing to take the vaccine, who said that they would take it once it was offered to them. That is probably the result of some effort to clarify messages around vaccines. So polls can be really important inputs into the policy process to help shape policy. But there's another way that people provide input into the policy process, and that's through communications with elected officials and with managers in government. Now, how do we communicate with public servants? I think the answers are pretty obvious here. We send letters, emails. We used to send faxes. I probably should take faxes out of my slides. Hardly anyone sends faxes anymore. Telephone calls are still an important means by which we communicate with elected officials. A lot of interest groups will encourage you to call your member of Congress or your senator or some other elected official to express your opinion about an issue. And the best way to do that, for what it's worth, is just call the office of your senator and say, hi, my name is Tom Birkeland, and I'm a constituent, and I just wanted Senator so-and-so to know my feelings about this issue. The people who answer the phone in congressional offices are usually very pleasant. They're very professional. They know how to do this, and they write these things down. They keep a log, and so they get a sense of what the public is thinking. They might say they're kind of taking the temperature of the public to see how people feel about hot button issues of the day. Congressional offices will get a lot of calls when a big bill is about to be passed, or perhaps maybe when a Supreme Court justice is being considered and things like that. And that's an important input. Now, the question is every communication with elected or appointed officials weighed equally or carefully? You want to ask yourself whether every input to these offices and to these people is equal. And the answer is probably not. And in a lot of cases, when there's a letter writing campaign or an email campaign, each message isn't necessarily read carefully, but they're sort of counted and weighed. So, wow, there's a lot of issues, a lot of interest in this issue. And if opinion is divided fairly evenly, it'll be, of course, up to the member of Congress or the elected official, or in the case of appointed officials or career civil servants, they'll need to take this into account. But not every communication is equal. But taken together, these sort of inputs are really important in the policy process. So how do interest groups encourage communication with officials? And interest groups are really important in public policy making. And how can interest groups be used to gauge public sentiment? And in gross terms, the interest groups can be relied upon to mobilize their members to express their opinions about issues if the issue has an influence on that interest group's agenda or interests. So interest group activity is a really important aspect of the inputs in the policy process, because interest groups mobilize communication to decision makers, and they amplify individual voices in decision making or in policy making. Any one of us alone probably doesn't have that loud a voice, if you will, in the policy process, but acting as a group, acting in concert with other people, amplifies the voices that we have in the policy process. Imagine you're a member of an environmental group, for example, and imagine your friends are interested in the environment, and you call up and say, hi, I'm really concerned about global climate change or endangered species or something like that, right? But what if an interest group says, I'm from the Friends of the Earth, and we have 3 million members that are really concerned about this bill? That amplifies those voices a little more than just 3 million people on their own, individually communicating with various officials. And oftentimes those members don't communicate at all. We rely on the group to do it for us. In other words, we join interest groups so that they will take on the responsibility and the task of informing elected officials, because that's what they're really good at. So interest group activity constitutes an important input to decision makers. We'll talk more about interest groups in chapter 5, but let me leave you with this thought. Interest groups are what really makes the process work in the United States. They're an important input in public policy, and group politics is central to policy making in the United States. And a lot of people are uncomfortable with the idea of interest groups, but they're really important, and they're uh, something you would expect to have in a constitutional system in which freedom of association was an important part of the political culture. So they're an important input. Now, the news media are really important inputs into the public policy process because they highlight issues. You know, whatever's on the front page of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, whatever's the lead story at CNN or NBC Nightly News or Fox, those things are going to have an influence on public policy making. They frame stories around issues. They tell stories, and stories often have heroes, victims, villains. The form of a news story is a narrative, and people really respond well to narratives. In chapter 11, I'll introduce to you a new model of the policy process called the narrative policy framework. And that really relies on the idea that stories are really important in policymaking. And those stories form an input into the policy process. Stories about whether people want to wear a mask or not, for example, during COVID, or stories about economic strain that people feel during economic downturns. All of those things have an influence on policymaking. And they provide avenues for communication for officials, for public officials, to communicate with the public. One example of this, for example, is a trial balloon. Sometimes people will put out an idea in the media saying, I think we're going to try to do this thing. For example, they might say to the media, to a reporter, I think we're going to require everybody in the state to wear a mask when they're indoors. And then they might get some feedback from that if that makes the news stories and people respond to it either positively or negatively. That's related to this notion of strategic leaking. A lot of times people will go on background. That means that they won't be named in news stories, but they'll leak information to the news media in such a way to benefit their group or their organization's interest, but also to send signals to not only the public, but to other participants in the policy process. So the news media are how groups communicate with each other in a lot of ways, and how information passes between various participants and various actors in the policy process. So then you put this in through the policy cycle, and you get some outputs in the policy process. And the first of those outputs are laws. Most public policies are codified as laws. There's two broad types of laws: statute law, which are the laws that are on the statute books, for example, the United States Code or your state code of statutes. For example, in Washington State, it's called the Revised Code of Washington. Alaska, it's called the Alaska Statutes. States like California have different codes, criminal code, civil code, environmental code, things like that. And those are all written down laws, and those are called statutes. And that's what we're primarily considering in the policy process when we're talking about legislation. But there's another form of law called case law, which we'll get into a little bit when we talk about the judicial branch, but that's the decisions that courts make about the interpretation of a law and about the constitutionality of a law. And case law is just as important as statute law, it just comes in a different form. Now, there's also regulations. Regulations are the things that executive branch agencies write and codify to implement the laws that are passed by the legislative branch. So regulations have the force of law. The difference between regulations and a lot of statute law is that regulations are really, really technical. One of my favorite examples is the federal aviation regulations, and in particular, something called an airworthiness directive. So I'm going to make up an example that sounds really esoteric. Let's say you've got a little airplane, like a little Cessna, those little single engine planes people like to fly around. and they have rudder pedals, and they have a steering wheel. It's called a yoke, and it pulls on various things to make the rudder and the elevators and all this stuff go. And let's say you have a rudder, right? And you learn that the cable that connects the pedals to the rudder rubs up against a part in the airplane and can fray and break. And if that rudder cable breaks, it makes the airplane harder to control and could result in a crash. Well, let's say the airplane manufacturer, Cessna, learns of this problem, and I'm making this up, so I'm not saying this really happened with Cessna, but let's say this happened with Cessna. They learned about this fraying, and they report it to the FAA and say, "Hey, look, there's this problem with the airplane. You've got to install this part so that this cable doesn't rub up against this other part and fray and become damaged and maybe become loose." And then the Federal Aviation Administration publishes something called an airworthiness directive. And that's published in something called the Federal Register, which is the daily newspaper of all the regulatory activity that takes place in the federal government. At the state level, for those things that are regulated by states, you have similar newsletters, forms of information. And then at the federal level, they're codified in something called the Code of Federal Regulations. And the Code of Federal Regulations is a big set of books. The Federal Register runs to tens of thousands of pages a year. And it's very technical, but it's very important to the people who read it and want to understand how the laws are going to be implemented. I think regulation is fascinating. Someday soon, I'm going to be doing some writing on why our aviation system in the United States was really safe in the 1990s, but got even safer. And the regulatory process had a great deal to do with that. It's esoteric and seems a little hard to understand sometimes, but as you become a subject matter expert in an area of policy, you'll learn about regulations and find them really important and interesting to engage with as you do your work. So now that laws or regulations have passed and been enacted, put into effect, implemented, the various actors in the policy process will engage in activities designed to evaluate a public policy or the oversight function in Congress. And oversight from a congressional perspective means ensuring that programs follow legislative intent. And the legislative intent can be things like, are the people being served that the policy was intended to serve? Are public funds being spent efficiently and effectively? Is there a minimum amount or no waste in the program, or burdensome regulations or things like that? So the legislative branch wants to be sure that the executive branch is doing what the legislative branch tasked them with doing in legislation. And the methods that Congress uses to engage in oversight includes commissioning reports from the Congressional Research Service or the Congressional Budget Office or the Government Accountability Office to see how policies work. In particular, the Government Accountability Office really does a lot of policy evaluation, a lot of economic and fiscal analysis. Many of you watching this video or in your studies may find it interesting to go to work for one of these organizations. They're held in high regard in Washington, D.C., and they contribute substantially to the evaluation of public policy and therefore to the effective management of government. Congress also holds oversight hearings, which are congressional hearings in which instead of considering legislation to be passed, they'll bring in officials from the executive branch agencies who are charged with implementing various programs and ask questions about how the program is going. And in some cases, these can be fairly contentious meetings and hearings in which these executive branch officials are grilled by members of Congress, asking questions about why was the law or why was regulation written the way it was, why were the regulations enforced the way they were, or perhaps why weren't regulations issued to enforce some aspect of the law. So these are the two broad methods that Congress uses to do policy evaluation. So policy evaluation is something that formal studies conducted by government contributes to. the government, both in the executive and legislative branch, will often undertake studies to see how policy works and whether it's having the effects that were hoped for when the policy was created. And also there's a policy evaluation through formal studies conducted by consultants, academics, and even interest groups, lobbyists, things like that, lobby organizations, interest groups who will undertake a study to understand whether and to what extent a public policy is working, and to suggest alternative policies that might be more effective in achieving various policy goals. It's important to note that some of those studies undertaken by interest groups are going to have a point of view. They're going to serve the interests of their groups, but taken together, it might be a useful source of information for a member of Congress or another legislative body trying to understand why policy works the way it does, or whether it's working the way that it was intended to work when it was initially enacted by the legislative branch. So to summarize, we can think of the policy process as a system with inputs, outputs conducted within a policy environment. And that systems are characterized, Lydia, okay, you're going to have to edit this out. We're going to start over. So to summarize, we can think of the policy process as a system, and systems are influenced by and influence their environments. Systems are characterized by inputs and outputs. The systems and stages models we use of the policy process are not perfect models, but they help to simplify a complex world. And our world is as complex today in its own way as the world has always been complex. Complexity has always been a feature of the United States. It's a big, wealthy, major industrial power. Many countries in the world are equally complex, and all these efforts on the part of policy scientists, students of the policy process, are efforts to try to better understand and make sense of this complexity. And I hope that some of the ideas in this chapter help you to make sense of a complex world. So that's a systems model and the stages model of the policy process. I hope you found this useful in making some sense of a remarkably complex policymaking world. I think you'll find yourself turning to these ideas over and over again as we delve more deeply into various elements of the policymaking system throughout the rest of this book.
Thanks for watching this video. As always, I really enjoy hearing from students and teachers about the book and about public policy. Feel free to reach out to me at tom@tomburkland.com or visit my website, tomburkland.com. Thanks again for watching.